Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent.
Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. Listen, it's an absolute joy to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me. Let's grab a hot chocolate. Listen, if there's any week that you will need a hot chocolate or a mocha or a coffee or honestly whatever your imbibement, this is the week because we have got some stuff to talk about. Even before we talk about the science, the news. 2 weeks ago, we did this 2 weeks ago. We talked 2 weeks ago. I miss you. But we talked 2 weeks ago and the news was like, oh yeah, there's a quick, there was some wild stuff going on, but hey, it's Donald Trump. What do we expect? But there was like a publication about the cast review in a major journal. And I was like, yeah, that'd be fun to talk about. And then we all talked about some, wild stuff about my own history. But, we talked a little bit about the current context, people losing their passports, but it wasn't, huge. I mean, people losing their passports was absolutely something I was concerned about. But in the last 2 weeks, things have just gone off the rails. For the trans community, particularly in the United States, things seem to be going from bad to catastrophically bad very, very quickly. So we need to talk about it. So the first thing we need to talk about is passports. So the passport situation for trans people in the United States, people are trying to get their passports renewed. They're finding it hard to get them renewed. They're not always being renewed. And for people who are getting them renewed, they are getting them without any kind of move from them. People who are trans, renewing their passports as usual, using all the documentation in the correct gender as usual, are having their passports reverted back to the gender they were assigned at birth. One of the most prominent people this has happened to is the legendary actor Hunter Schafer, who was in Euphoria, star of Euphoria, and amazing in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. We've talked about her before on the podcast. I'm a huge fan, and it's amazing to hear her talk about this experience. So here is Hunter Schafer.
I've had to do this one time before. No part of the process was different. I filled everything out just like I normally would. I put female, and when it was picked up today and I opened it up, they had changed the marker to male. And I'm not making this post to fearmonger or to create drama or receive consolation. I don't need it, but I do think it's worth posting to sort of note the reality of the situation and that it is actually happening. And I was shocked because I don't know. I just didn't think it was actually going to happen.
It's amazing that people in the States are, trans people are losing their opportunity to have documentation in their affirmed gender. Donald Trump has also removed the X marker on passports for non-binary people. And we're just getting started. I don't even know where this is going to go, but it is pretty dire stuff, if I'm honest. And this is kind of, as we're talking about echelons of concern, right? We talked a little bit last time about losing your passport being one of the highest echelons of concern because it's the means by which you flee if things turn really bad. And I had somebody ask me recently, it was a good question. They wrote in and asked, what is my major concern? What's the end game? What would be a really big worry for me in the future, particularly in the States, but generally what keeps me up at night? And my response to them before what happened to very recently on March the 1st happened, right? My response to them was, listen, my major concern is that they'll try and do in a bigger way what they tried to do in Florida, which was to ban drag performances, right? They started to suggest that drag performances were inherently sexual, and then they tried to pass a bill that would ban drag performances in Florida. They basically introduced a bill, HB 1423 and SB 1438, that would expand state law to include vague language that could be used very easily to attack drag shows and performances as exposing minors to sexual content, basically. But the Supreme Court at the very end of 2023 basically refused to reinstate that law in Florida, which meant that basically it put a temporary stop on that law being implemented. It's unenforceable. So Florida was kind of, to some extent, I think, saved. But the ultimate concern that I have is that will happen more broadly, right? That they will say, well, being trans is inherently some kind of like a form of indecent exposure, right? That being trans is inherently a form of indecent exposure and therefore criminalized. And what will happen in those circumstances, of course, is that trans people being out and in public in any setting would be criminalized and people could be arrested for it. And that stuff really concerns me. And then we saw very recently in the last few days, Montana, the House in Montana passing an indecent exposure bill applying only to trans people. And this stuff is really difficult, so please do look after yourself. We're going to hear from Representative Zoe Zephyr, who represents Missoula in the 95th District in the Montana House of Representatives. She's a trans woman, openly trans woman, absolute legend. And she spoke very movingly in the House of Representatives about this law. So this is Representative Zoe Zephyr.
2 indecent exposure laws. 1 in our existing statute where someone is trying to abuse a person, where someone is trying to get sexual gratification. And you have another indecent exposure law where the crime is being trans. It is going to a gym, which I do regularly, by the way. It is going to a gym, working out, and then going to change in the changing room. This law would make the process I do regularly in my hometown of Missoula an indecent exposure law. For the edification of this body, I am a trans woman who has undergone gender reassignment surgery. I have female genitalia. How are they supposed to know? Are they supposed to say, oh, I recognize Representative Zephyr? We should target her because she had the audacity to live her life. I hope this body would one day leave my people alone.
Thanks so very much to Representative Zoe Zephyr, one of the few trans people in these kinds of positions to be able to speak on these issues and actively doing so. Incredible to hear her. Another representative, Pete Elverum, also spoke on this on the floor. He said, direct quote, "What are we asking to do here is make it criminal for someone to just exist and go to the bathroom and not do anything to any other person, quite simply just to be who they are." As has been mentioned, we've been sitting and listening to these, and I've been holding my breath, sitting on my hands, wondering at what point it will be enough. When can we just stand up and, man, this is enough. This is the stuff that keeps me up at night. This is the real frightening stuff. That you create a law that excludes trans people from public life, criminalizes trans people for existing, and gives you the opportunity to imprison trans people simply for being. We are going to do an episode about trans people's experience in prison, and it is horrifying, truly, truly horrifying, some of the research. So, hey, we'll get into it together, but maybe not this week. Before we get into this week's topic, we've got one more news story. I know they just keep coming. This one is about the science. So President Trump has issued a directive to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC in the US, to withdraw or retract journal articles featuring forbidden terms. Now, these terms include gender, transgender, LGBT. in an effort to silence the science that would otherwise be published, to withdraw or retract journal articles featuring forbidden terms this is the thing, right? A lot of what we've talked about today I've never seen before, right? I mean, the crime of being trans, I saw that attempt to be done in Florida, and now, obviously it looks like other states are trying to take it up, and I've not really seen people lose their passports or have their passports so sharply changed to reflect their gender at birth instead of the gender they are. I've never seen that, but this is really out there, to withdraw or retract journal articles featuring terms like gender, transgender, LGBT. That's wild. Writing in the British Medical Journal, huge journal, the editors wrote a freaking editorial on this. Clark and Abbasi wrote this. Direct quotation. "It is absurd that the scientific record be treated with such disregard. It is egregious that a country's public health agency or any government authority should demand the erasure of any terminology, particularly medically relevant terminology. This amounts to the censorship of scientists, a breach of rights to free expression, and the dehumanization of LGBT individuals. Make no mistake. This instruction is not about defending women or women's rights, as the Trump's executive order implies. It is part of a broader complicity of this US government and other political and religious conservatives with gender ideology that seeks a return to fundamentalist values." The BMJ, the British Medical Journal, issued that editorial. It's a good read if you have the chance. Clark and Abbasi 2025. But that it was necessary is terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. A huge chilling effect on the community trying to do research in this field. It only affects CDC journals and authors, but it still obviously has this kind of broader chilling effect. I was listening to people talk about the problems of getting work published that talks about diversity of neuronal firing, for example. I've been hearing that people going to conferences and they're finding scientists in tears because they're worried about their careers, that they can't get their work published in journals very easily now. But it's chaos, right? Like it's not clear how wide this is going to be influential. It's not clear whether journals are going to anticipate this being challenging and make it harder to publish in this field. It's just it's all extremely unclear. It's absolute chaos out there right now. And it just keeps going. We just keep getting more and more executive orders, more and more challenges. And I don't know how the community is faring, but not well. I don't think the community is faring very well at all in the United States right now. And, maybe as part of that, this week, oh goodness, it's so much, isn't it? Like, I find it a lot. And we've not even got to what's happening this week. Because this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a statement from a public figure, sometimes the President of the United States, sometimes the Vice President of the United States, sometimes all kinds of people, this time a representative once again. And we are going to take, as we always do, their confident declarations for the statements we're sure they're intended to be, because come on, they're going to do the questions, right? And we try to answer those questions by looking to the scientific literature to see if we can't find an answer. And okay, so this week, I do need you to be quite, to look after yourself, because we're going to hear from Representative Nancy Mace. She's an American politician who's been the U.S. representative for South Carolina's 1st congressional district since 2021. She's a Republican, and she is known for speaking on trans issues in quite bold terms. And indeed, she's going to do that here. So she's going to use some words which are choice and pretty direct and pretty discriminatory she's going to use an epithet which to those in the community is maybe the worst epithet you can use for our community. So please look after yourself. The clip is only like 30 seconds long. So the clip's going to start and you're going to hear first from ranking member Jerry Connolly as he tries to challenge something that Nancy Mace did in her own statement. And then you're going to hear from Nancy Mace. So here is Representative Nancy Mace.
The gentlelady has used a phrase that is considered a slur in the LGBTQ community and the transgender community. And let me please finish without interruption. And
Tranny. I don't really care. You want penises in women's bathrooms, and I'm not going to have it.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Let
disgusting.
the gentleman state his parliamentary inquiry.
to me, a slur is a slur. And here in the committee, a level of decorum requires us to try consciously to avoid slurs. You just heard the gentlelady actually actively, robustly repeat it. And I would just ask the chairman that she be counseled that we ought not to be engaged. We can have debate and policy discussion without offending human beings who are our fellow citizens. And so I would ask, as a parliamentary inquiry, whether the use of that phrase is not, in fact, a violation of the decorum rules.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to be counseled by a man over men and women's spaces or men who have mental health issues dressing as women. I'm not being counseled by some guy.
My inquiry is to the
this.
chairman,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Order. The inquiry is about decorum. Decorum is at the discretion of the chair.
That's
I will be
mansplaining,
honest,
Mr. Chairman.
with the ranking member. I'm not up to date on my politically correct LGBTQ terminology.
Thanks so very much to Representative Nancy Mace for such an interesting question posed, as they often are, in the form of confident declaration. I've just done my voice training, so this is probably not the moment to record halfway through my podcast, having done half the recording, and then, hey, what do you want from me? Thanks so very much to Nancy Mace for such an interesting question. Representative Mace posed, as they often aren't, in the form of stigmatizing epithets, but yeah, we'll take it for the question we're sure it's intended to be. We'll see if we can't find an answer together. The question then is maybe, why don't we do this? Like, why don't we allow people to say things like this in public? Why is this a bad thing? Is this not freedom of speech? We should just say the T word out loud and, about a marginalized group of people. Can't we just use epithets in public now? Well, listen, there's a reason why we don't do that. And the reason is because stigma has some really interesting effects on people. Now, I really want to look at this for a couple of reasons, not just because Nancy Mace decided to use possibly the most offensive epithet for my community that there is in the House of Representatives, sure, but also because, everything we have heard today from all of these sources, whether it be about sort of restrictions on science, whether it be about passports, whether it be about laws designed to criminalize transgender people just being out in public, these are all examples of stigma, because the stigmatizing belief that underpins all of them, you heard from Representative Mace at the end there. Representative Mace says, you want penises in women's bathrooms, forgive the language. And she also describes trans women as men with mental health problems who dress as women. So you can understand why somebody like Representative Mace, maybe you can't understand why they would say that, but neither can I. But under the surface, the belief that informs it is a stigmatizing belief that trans women, particularly trans women, sorry, trans guys and non-binary folk, it's always trans women that are the subject here. Different kinds of marginalization, one invisibilizing and the other actively kind of excluding from public life. It's still bad either way. But this is, trans women are men in Republican Mace's view here. And she's not alone in that view. And that stigmatizing belief has interesting effects on the people who experience it. Now, and you can hear I'm working on my voice. And the reason that I'm working on my voice with my voice trainer, who is the same voice trainer I met when I first transitioned like 10, 12 years ago, before I got too comfortable. The reason I'm doing it is because I'm trying to fight the internalized stigma. I think I'm trying to hide in plain sight better. I'm trying not to let people know I'm trans so much, like that I meet. I hung out with some wonderful people this week because I was doing interviews. And I met a couple of people who I was kind of doing group task with, and we did a bunch of deliberation afterwards. And I got to tell you, there's something wonderful about being in a space with a person, just chatting and laughing and doing some proper kind of deliberation and valuing each other's input and just, I don't know, there's something wonderful about that experience, especially when I do it as a woman and not as the trans person in the goddamn room, right? Like, I have made a career out of being the trans person in the room, in almost every room I'm in. And the complication of that is that I can't live my life just as a girl in the world because I made it so that I couldn't do that. And most of the time, I'm happy with that. But now suddenly, I'm less so. Like, I don't want to be seen as a trans person. And I think that right there is internalized stigma. I think where we are going to land is that trans people who experience these kind of stigmatizing beliefs can internalize them. And that internalization can actually be very harmful, in Ilan Mayer's kind of view, maybe even a proximal stressor in minority stress theory that can cause physical and mental health concerns. Now, to start, we need to understand how prevalent are these kind of stigmatizing beliefs. And to start with, we're going to go to Tankersley, Grafsky, Dyke and Jones, 2021, Risk and Resilience Factors for Mental Health Among Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Youth, a Systematic Review. They brought together 44 studies, all looking at essentially kind of abuse and stigmatization. And they found that most of the studies were conducted in the USA. Some were cross-national, some were in Canada, in Germany, Finland, Australia. In China, there was one, and one in the UK. So obviously, as we always find, Western and English-speaking countries are disproportionately heavily represented in the research. But they found, most interestingly, victimization, discrimination, like bullying, peer victimization, school-based victimization, painful and provocative events, abuse of various kinds are all prevalent, and they're all risk factors for mental health. They are associated with negative health outcomes, particularly mental health outcomes. They're associated with self-harm, with trigger warning. We're going to talk a little bit about suicidal ideation. I realize trigger warnings are not particularly helpful. In the research, they're not very helpful, but I think it is helpful just to kind of say we are and always will talk about suicidality on this podcast, for which I do apologize. It is simply a part of every piece of research. I don't think there's ever been a week where we haven't talked about this. Forgive me. It just is. Victimization is associated with suicidal ideation, self-harm, and suicide attempts, and depressive symptoms and missing school due to the distress it causes. So active discrimination experiences are associated with psychopathology, mental health problems, stress, extreme despair, non-suicidal self-injury and suicide attempts, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, stress-related suicidal thoughts, and more general suicidal distress. So these kind of active acts of victimization, as we've already talked about before, are really harmful to people. But what I found really interesting was that higher levels of, for transgender and gender non-conforming adolescents around the world, right, presenting for care at gender clinics, higher levels of internalized transphobia were independently associated with increased likelihood of meeting diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorders and for generalized anxiety disorders. Low self-esteem also predicts psychopathology. For older adolescents, college-age people, perceived burdensomeness was also independently associated with suicidal ideation and attempts. So there's this kind of the secondary impacts, right? The secondary impacts of abuse and victimization are things like low self-esteem, which has its own independent effect on psychopathology, on burdensomeness. Feeling like a burden is independently associated with suicidal ideation and attempts, and internalized transphobia also associated with an increased likelihood of meeting diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder and for generalized anxiety disorder. You know, these are serious mental health experiences, right? So internalized transphobia increases that risk. So we need to talk about internalized transphobia off the back of experiencing these kind of stigmatizing experiences. Now, of course, not only is stigma kind of prevalent in the US and clearly in the UK, Australia, Finland, Canada, Germany, but around the world, stigma of gender diverse communities is extremely prevalent. So in Samoa, Andust and colleagues 2022, when they do that kind of bad thing to me, I feel that they encourage me to be strong and be who I am. This is beautiful. How trans feminine people in Samoa, Tonga, and the Cook Islands experience discrimination, acceptance, and a sense of place in culture, health, and sexuality. They conducted 18 interviews with trans feminine folk from Tonga, Samoa, and the Cook Islands, and 13 transcripts talked about particularly overcoming adversity and finding a place for yourself. Super interesting. Their experience of discrimination and stigma, the kind of stigmatizing beliefs. They talk about people keeping on swearing at them when they walk on the road, when they go out at nighttime, out to the nightclubs. They experience getting punched. They experience structural and societal stigma in employment and in families and across their experience. In Pakistan, as our and colleagues in 2024, I would prefer to be dead than to live this way. Experiences of stigma and discrimination against Khwaja Sira in Swat, Pakistan. They talk about, they brought together like 45 Khwaja Sira in Mongora, Swat, Pakistan, to participate in in-depth qualitative interviews. And these folk were over the age of 18, but their experiences, clearly they experience extraordinary stigma in Pakistan. Some quotes. I started working in a tailor shop while as a student. I wanted to learn tailoring skills, but there were people who did not leave me in peace. My younger brother was also working with me in that shop, and the boys of that village would come to the shop and they would use vulgar language against me. They would harass and abuse me in front of my younger brother. They treated me like a doll for their pleasure. I couldn't tolerate all of this, so I left that job too. When I went to school and college, people in society made fun of me. They used to call me different names and they made my life difficult. This was really difficult for me to tolerate. I thought that when I completed my education, the situation would change. Perhaps once I completed my diploma in electrical engineering, I could join a company. When that time came, though, I faced more hatred than I did in my student life. When I went to school and college, people already knew that I was Khwaja Sira. I faced many difficult situations during that time. I can't go to school the same way every day. Every day I would go on a different route to protect myself. Different groups of boys and people waited for me on the way. They would have kidnapped me by force. Incredible. And in Thailand, Srikamoon and colleagues, 2023, experiences of being bullied and quality of life of transgender women in Chiang Mai province in Thailand. And in Iran, Nematola, Farnham, and colleagues in 2022, discrimination, violence, and suicide in transgender women in Iran, published in Healthcare for Women International. Incredible. 127 transgender women were enrolled. 86.6% of them reported being discriminated in their families. 70% had experienced physical violence. 92% had experienced verbal or emotional violence in Iran. 76% were subject to violence in public places. 72% at home. And 44% reported violence to their friends. And the main reason they wouldn't tell someone about what had happened is 71.9% thought that reporting it, telling someone, was useless. 63% of participants experienced sexual violence. It's extraordinary. 71.7% thought of suicide because of their transgender identity, and just over half had attempted suicide. Extraordinary, right? And in Cambodia, Yi and colleagues, social marginalization, gender-based violence and binge drinking among transgender women in Cambodia. And in China, Chen and colleagues in 2020, cross-sectional study of mental health, suicidal ideation and suicide attempts among transgender women in Jiangsu province in China, in the Journal of Affective Disorders, they find that, it's extraordinary, really. They find that suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts are prevalent about just under half of trans women in Jiangsu province in China. And that's hugely elevated from the 12 to 16% experiencing suicidal ideation and 2 to 3% attempting suicide in the wider Chinese population. They concur this. They say, we concur with other researchers that the main reason for mental health problems among trans women is their marginalization in society, with accompanying discrimination, micro and macroaggressions, and late legal recognition and protection in China. It's everywhere, right? I mean, I did my best to find studies that weren't just English-speaking, like weird, white, educated, democratic societies. And I found a bunch that were people. And what were those experiences like? It's amazing to hear people's actual words from Henderson and colleagues looking in the United States. People, they brought together basically people from 14 to 18 years of age, the median age being 16. They got 20 people. 10 of them identified as cisgender, 4 cisgender girls, 4 identified as cisgender boys, 2 were trans, 4 were another gender identity entirely, and 10 identified as bisexual, 6 as lesbian, and 4 as gay. And so this is sort of broader LGBT experiences, but they describe the stigmatizing experiences as follows. I know people are like, oh, words aren't supposed to hurt, but they do. They can scar a person for life. It's not very aggressive. It's more passive aggressive, like stares and whispers. Freshman year was when I first cut my hair short and I started looking more like a queer student, and 2 girls who were sophomores would pass by the halls and they'd whisper, look at the queer. And then they use a pretty horrendous epithet I will not utter here. I know personally online I've been harassed over simple things. My friends tag me in posts supporting gay rights, and I get messages saying all this crap about how I'm going to burn in hell. One of them said to me, I get that you want to express yourself and all, but you don't have to walk around looking stupid wearing girls' clothes and stuff. My friend would say, like, you're a boy. You consider yourself a girl when you're not. Yeah, it was hostile in terms of it being like, don't be near me. I would prefer you, like, stay away from me. And it was like, our table is kind of full. There's not really much room here, so there's really nowhere you can sit. And it's like, but look, each table can sit 16 people and you have 12. What are you talking about? This kind of verbal harassment that underpins kind of what you can hear as stigmatizing belief, right? You're a boy. You consider yourself a girl when you're not. Is a stigmatizing belief. In fact, the same stigmatizing belief as Nancy Mace started to talk about in Congress, right? So these experiences of kind of abuse and sort of discrimination and marginalization and victimization, what is the likely experience if you get faced with this kind of stigma in your environment? What are the likely effects? Well, Kersley and colleagues in 2021, Risk and Resilience Factors for Mental Health Among Transgender and Gender Non-Conforming Youth, a systematic review. They basically bring a huge systematic review together. In fact, it's the same systematic review we talked about earlier. Still 44 studies involved in the systematic review looking at these kind of huge experiences of victimization worldwide. But they also generated a kind of theory about how this sort of stigmatizing environments, how verbal abuse, physical abuse, discrimination, victimization, violence, observable environmental threats can have a kind of trickle-down effect on the sort of individual, right? Beyond the direct effect of experiencing physical and verbal abuse, discrimination, violence, and victimization, right? They say that these stressors can have an effect, what that they call is a trickle-down effect, an effect that may promote hypervigilance and the anticipation of future harm, which may then dysregulate interpersonal interactions. So people engage in social isolation, they withdraw, they can develop kind of interpersonal problems where they're hypervigilant, or they can just avoid going out at all, like they just isolate themselves. And that's one of the ways in which people can react to, in a negative way, in a way that causes further harm, the stigmatization in environment. Now, the reason I find that super interesting is I think all marginalized folk know that experience. If you're across a bar and somebody double takes in your direction, or you hear someone laugh in the vicinity, or someone stares from across the street, there's a sort of experience that I think trans people know well, and I think gender diverse people know well. I think quite possibly any marginalized person knows quite well. It's a sort of immediate laser focus on the source of that stare or that double take or that laugh, because you are always somewhat vigilant to the potential for threat in your environment. Always, always, always. You don't really notice it until someone double takes and you suddenly become very alert to that. You're laser focused on it. And so that's one way to avoid those situations, like the small cuts of inclusion. That's one way in which people can respond to external stigmatizing experiences through a kind of internalized stigma. You are internalizing the idea that people are dangerous to you and that the world is dangerous to you, and you're anticipating potential future harm, so you dysregulate your interpersonal interactions, isolate and get out of there. But the other one is the one that I find really, they're both interesting, but this one is one I didn't expect. So Kersley and colleagues say, ultimately, these kind of stresses become internalized by the young person in the form of self-hatred and low self-esteem. Now, in the original stigma theory, the idea was that, I think it's Gerstmann, original stigma theory. Am I right? Goffman. I wasn't. It's Goffman. Original stigma theory, I think, if I remember right, had this view of internalized stigma as a process where a person absorbs and ultimately ends up believing the negative societal attitudes about their identity that leads to a kind of self-deprecation, a kind of self-devaluation, or a belief in oneself as inhabiting a lower status position in society as a consequence of those stigmatizing beliefs, which is, I think, quite interesting. Now, I did find a really beautiful quote, actually, from Kathleen Gallo, who writes in the first person about self-stigma she's experienced as somebody living with mental illness, as she describes it. She says, "I perceive myself quite accurately, unfortunately, as having a serious mental illness, and therefore as having been relegated to what I called the social garbage heap. I tortured myself with the persistent and repetitive thought that people I would encounter, even total strangers, did not like me and wished that mentally ill people like me did not exist. Thus, I would do things such as standing away from others at bus stops, hiding and cringing in the far corners of subway cars, thinking of myself as garbage. I would even leave the sidewalk in what I thought of as exhibiting the proper deference to those above me in the social class. The latter group, of course, included all other human beings." She's a beautiful writer. Incredible. So this is, I think, a good example of the first form that St. Tankersley talks about, this sort of self-stigma as you see yourself as part of what you see potentially society sees as a lower social class, and then the hypervigilance, the anticipation of future harm, the dysregulation of interpersonal interactions that leads you to self-isolate and not engage with people, and therefore not have the opportunity to challenge the belief, right? Which is super interesting. Now, I find that very, very interesting. But the other end of it is still fascinating to me, and I don't still understand it. The kind of internalization of the self-stigma, right? The belief, and I guess there's a little bit of it in what she's describing, right? What Gallo is describing about her own experience does kind of feature that sort of internalization of the self-stigma, the thinking of myself as garbage. I would even leave the side work in what I thought of as exhibiting the proper deference to those above me in social class, the latter group being everyone else. So, you know, she is talking about that kind of, that latter bit, the thinking of myself as garbage, is absolutely the internalization, right? It's not just that she feels like the world is going to see her as garbage and therefore that she should avoid other people because of the risk of harm. She thinks of herself as garbage right at the end there, torturing herself. So I think that's the internalization of stigma. Now, Richer, Ottillingham and Grajales in 2003 in psychiatry research published a piece called Internalized Stigma and Mental Illness, Psychometric Properties of a New Measure, where they look at a measure. It's called the Internalized Stigma of Mental Illness Inventory. And if we were to look at that and try and apply it to gender diversity, I think we might get a sense of what internalized stigma looks like. So I feel out of place in a world because I am transgender is the first. People discriminate against me because I am trans. I avoid getting close to people who aren't trans to avoid rejection. I'm embarrassed or ashamed that I'm trans. Trans people shouldn't get married. People who are trans make important contributions to society. I feel inferior to others who aren't trans. I don't socialize as much as I used to because my transness might make me look or behave weird. People who are trans can't live a good, rewarding life. I don't talk about myself much because I don't want to burden others with my transness. Negative stereotypes about transgender people keep me isolated from the normal world. Being around people who aren't trans makes me feel out of place or inadequate. I feel comfortable being seen in public with an obviously trans person. That one there speaks to me so deeply. So deeply. I feel comfortable being seen in public with an obviously trans person. I might have a good chunk of internalized self-stigma. Let's keep going. People often patronize me or treat me like a child just because I'm trans. I'm disappointed in myself for being trans. Being trans has spoiled my life. People can tell that I'm trans by the way I look. I stay away from social situations in order to protect my family and friends from embarrassment. People who aren't trans couldn't possibly understand me. People ignore me or take me less seriously just because I'm trans. I can't contribute anything to society because I'm trans. Living as trans has made me a tough survivor. Nobody would be interested in getting close to me because I'm trans. In general, I'm able to live my life the way I want to. I can have a good, fulfilling life despite being trans. Others think that I can't achieve much in life because I'm trans. Stereotypes about trans people apply to me. Can you find a better example of self-stigma than that one right there? Stereotypes about trans people apply to me. This kind of internalized self-stigma is potentially very harmful, right? As people not only do the kind of anticipate harm in their environment and so they withdraw, but also they start to see themselves through the eyes of that stigma and therefore develop a kind of self-disgust or self-hatred and low self-esteem. So the hiding, and one of the things that I find super, super interesting here, right, is that from Payne's study in 2024, Too Much Trouble, Transgender and Non-Binary People's Experiences of Stigmatization and Stigma Avoidance in the Workplace, Work and Occupations. Really cool study. They look at how trans people specifically and non-binary people avoid that kind of stigma. It's not just about kind of the literal avoidance by not going to a place, although that absolutely does feature. People who are reluctant to apply for jobs, or they're reluctant to go to public spaces because they are anticipating that kind of discrimination. But there's also a kind of, for trans people, it also is about passing, right? For trans people, passing privilege is about looking cisgender, or maybe not looking transgender is more about it, right? That the ability to pass, or the aspiration to pass, can be a reaction to that same self-stigma. Here's a direct quotation from a participant from this study. I would say people are more forgiving when you're not trans or when you pass. I noticed a change directly proportional to when I was able to pass, and passing is really problematic. But when I was able to pass, people took me seriously at interview. And other than that, if my hair wasn't right or if it was raining or something, there's very little sympathy. People don't know what it's like to be a trans woman and present a certain way. A lot of times we don't have the same income. So if you're starting your transition, if you don't have money to take a car to the interview so you don't mess up your hair, we're oftentimes just sweating it out in the subway like regular people. But I feel like we're treated with stricter criteria. There's less room to mess up. And that alienates a lot of the beginning young trans people that are trying to join the workforce. There are so many barriers. They don't have the makeup. They don't have the possibility. Passing is, I think, like, it's a privilege that's unearned, right? And more than that, it is a way of responding to the self-stigma that people experience, and a way of responding to the wider societal stigma. It's a way to respond to the external stigma because hiding in plain sight avoids the discrimination, the abuse that people so often experience for being overtly trans. But it also means that you don't see yourself as trans. And that helps you to avoid the internalized stigma that you feel about being trans in this world, which is wild to me, right? Is that what I'm doing? Is that what I'm doing with my voice right now? Is trying to pass in a world that hates trans people so much more obviously does it hate trans people right now? And the more that it does, the more that I can't help but internalize it. And then I am focused really hard on my voice, right? And on my presentation. But there is one study called from Ernst, and in fact from Richer, that study about the internalized stigma of mental illness inventory that we applied to transgender people, they talk in that study about stigma resistance. And Anders and colleagues from 2022, when they do that kind of bad thing to me, I feel they encourage me to be strong and be who I am. How trans feminine people in Samoa, Tonga, and the Cook Islands experience discrimination, acceptance, and a sense of place, published in Culture, Health, and Sexuality. That study is about resistance to stigma. And I don't know how anybody does this. I can't find a lot of research about internalized self-stigma or about stigma resistance when it comes to the LGBT community. But this study from Anders and these 18 trans feminine participants from Tonga, Samoa, and the Cook Islands talk about resistance in their description, and I think we can learn from them. So let's hear directly from them. Around my area, direct quotation, they know that I am trans. They are accepting, but when we go further into the community, coming into town where there are lots of boys, and they know that I'm trans, they start giving out some bad words. Something like that, to know that I am trans. It makes me shy sometimes, but it's like an encouragement. when they do that kind of bad thing to me, I feel they encourage me to be strong and to be who I am. It makes you feel like that you're sad, like that you're left behind from the world, that you do not belong to Tonga, that you don't belong in that school. I said, drop out. I walked away. No more school. I go out and find which place is right for me. It's a happy and a free life. Now, I'm very proud of myself. That's from Liliko. When I was young, I was exposing myself to more risk in terms of coming into cultural things because there are certain, having the roles of men to be played as men. And it's quite difficult sometimes because I have to act like a man. But slowly, I think I'm becoming exposed to some of these areas like LGBTIQ, sexual orientation, human rights, and all this, forums that I've been attending. I started to think, oh, it's my right, and no one has to deny that. That's from Huhulu. I see myself as an agent of change. I've been very vocal about Fa'afafine and about LGBTQIA community here in Samoa. This is my area of passion. That's from Rongo Mai Wenoa. LGBT here in Tonga are fighting for their rights. From Siola. My mum supports me very much. She is always the one taking care of all my clothes, even with the bras. When it comes to acceptance, it's a matter of love instead of understanding, because people will understand you and they will still judge you, but not the people who love you, because the people who love you will accept you no matter what, or who you are, or what you identify as. They might not understand you, but they will still love you because you are family. From Lae. I think now we have a response to Representative Mace. Representative Mace, when you use the epithets that you used when you described trans people as men with mental health challenges who like to dress up as women, when you describe us as penises in women's restrooms, what you do is you add a stigmatizing belief to the world. You advocate a stigmatizing belief. You add to the increasing din of voices telling trans people that they're not valid, telling trans women that they're men, telling trans men that they're vulnerable young girls affected by social contagion, telling non-binary people that they're invalid. And the problem with that is that people will internalize that stigma. They will start to avoid the world more because they're fearful of being harmed, but they'll also internalize it so they see themselves through your eyes. This stigmatizing view will become a view that risks changing how they see themselves. Not only how they interact with the world, but how they interact with themselves. But what we learn here from this literature is that trans people aren't going anywhere, but more than that we can respond to these stigmatizing views with resistance, with self-compassion, with community, with activism, and with what Lai described as love. When it comes to acceptance, it's a matter of love instead of understanding, because people will understand you, they will still judge you, but not the people who love you, because the people who love you will accept you no matter what or who you are or what you identify as. They might not understand you, but they will still love you because you are family. To my gender diverse community out there, you are family. And with love and connection and activism, we will make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very, very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you. This is Classroom Psychology. And hey, drop us a line, share us with someone you love. Our community can only benefit from growing. You are very, very welcome here. This is Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.